Knowledge Adventures, or NKA, is composed of a group of volunteers who like to share their passion for lifelong learning with others. Please note that during today's presentation, microphones will be muted, but we encourage you to write any questions you have in the chat. Our presenter is Stephanie Bonnick, Director of Education and Curatorial Services at the National First Ladies Library and Museum in Canton, Ohio. With an MA in History from Bowling Green State University, specializing in women's history and American enslavement, Stephanie is dedicated to illuminating often overlooked narratives in American history. In this role, she leads educational programming and outreach while assisting in collections management, ensuring exhibits are both engaging and historically accurate. I believe we're in for a treat at the end when Stephanie plans to share some historic items she curates. Through innovative programming and research, she honors legacies of America's first ladies while fostering historical literacy and inclusivity for all. Please join us in welcoming Stephanie Bonnick.
Thank you so much, Gypsy. Thank you so much to AARP, and thank you all for being here this morning or afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from today. I am in the afternoon, while I know many of you are still celebrating an early start. So I thank you for being here today and for allowing me to talk with you. As Gypsy said, my name is Stephanie Bonnick. I'm the Director of Education and Curatorial Services at the National First Ladies Library and Museum in Canton, Ohio. And I'm going to share my screen here in a second. As Gypsy said, if you have questions, please feel free to share those in the chat, and I will take questions at the end. I'm going to get started here. Today, I'm going to be talking a little bit more about Jackie Kennedy Onassis, who remains, as I was saying earlier to some, she remains today one of our most well-known, well-researched, most intriguing first ladies in American history. And for many of you, she was going through many of what I'm going to be talking about today in your lifetime. So you'll probably remember some of these things. As Gypsy said at the end of my presentation, I'm going to show a few of our archival objects in our collection that go perfectly with this program. A bit more about what we do here, the National First Ladies Library Museum. Not sure if anyone has ever been able to visit us or even knew that we existed, but the National First Ladies Library Museum is the only institution of its kind in the world. Both nationally and internationally, the National First Ladies Library Museum is dedicated to telling the history of all of the First Ladies of the United States. Officially founded in 1995 by Mary Regula, who you see at the bottom here, the library was intended to help fill gaps in American history where First Ladies' stories should be told, their lives researched. It was then in 2000 that former President Bill Clinton signed a bill establishing the National First Ladies Historic Site as the 380th unit of the National Park Service. Today, that relationship still thrives between the Library and Museum, a nonprofit organization, in tandem with the National Park Service. Our campus, should you get a chance to visit us, not only hosts the Library and Museum, where I'm currently located, but also preserves and maintains the Saxton McKinley House, childhood home to First Lady Ida McKinley, a Cantonian herself. The museum also hosts a Victorian theater, a research library, conference and seminar rooms, archival storage and processing rooms, as well as our administrative offices, and especially, of course, our featured and temporary exhibits on display. Our current 2024-25 featured exhibit, which will run through the end of April next year, is titled Leaders in Literacy, First Ladies as Teachers, Educators, and Librarians, which features over a dozen First Ladies who have dedicated part, if not all of their life, to shaping young minds and promoting literacy and education. Now, without further ado, I would like to get into the meat of our program today, titled Ripped from the Headlines, Jackie's Fight for Privacy. And as I said, I have also brought along some few archival collection objects for your enjoyment. As a pop culture and fashion icon, the life of Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy Onassis is one that is deeply complex, full of tragedy, and especially impactful in American history. Despite her naturally introspective nature, her life was chronicled publicly until the day that she died. In fact, we believe that Jackie Onassis would have liked nothing more than privacy, a privilege afforded to many of us average Americans. And even before she was born, young Jackie generated much excitement and made the newspapers prior to her arrival. Excuse me. Born on July 28, 1929, Jacqueline Bouvier was the eldest daughter of Janet Lee and John Black Jack Bouvier. Born just mere months before the crash of 1929, young Jackie was born to a wealthy family high on the social register. You can imagine then, undoubtedly, the 1929 stock market crash deeply affected her family. It is actually believed then that Black Jack Bouvier's wealth never recovered from this. And her first photograph, young Jackie Bouvier, was when she was only 5 months old, posed with her mother in the Brooklyn Daily Eagle Society column. Her second birthday, which also included pony rides, was the first time that she was the sole subject of a news article featured in the East Hampton Star. At 5 years old, the same newspaper identified young Bouvier as one of the most attractive riders in a horse show. At age 8, the Daily News featured her at another horse show, and the East Hampton Star called her, quote, a little miss with her lovely curls and well-cut riding habit, who presented a picture the judges and audience could not resist. In fact, as you will learn, it was Jackie Bouvier's love of horseback riding that would continue through the rest of her life. Jackie's mother, Janet Lee, not pictured unfortunately in this slide, was herself a high register socialite whose family was instrumental in some of New York City's planning and infrastructure, specifically of Central Park. Her father, Black Jack Bouvier, who is pictured here in the center photo, was also of high status, but as his nickname implied, he was quite the gambler. Unfortunately, Black Jack also struggled with alcoholism, which would later take his own life, and was a known womanizer. I want to clarify again that it was alcoholism that would take his life, as he would eventually struggle with liver issues. And unfortunately, that final attribute of being a womanizer is what would finally cause young Jacqueline's parents to divorce in 1940 when she was only 11 years old. This divorce, despite their social standing, would bring especially scandal, but a lot of unwanted attention and gossip as well surrounding the family. As a result, young Jackie Bouvier would become more inward looking. She would be known for being very fond of her privacy and would be seen as a very quiet individual. Following her parents' divorce, she was especially noted for being a little bit more inward, keeping to herself, and yet those who knew her best would still often comment that she was deeply intelligent and especially witty. Now, in 1942, Janet remarried Hugh D. Auchincloss, someone even higher on the social register than the Lees or the Bouviers, and with this new marriage came new siblings. We do know for the most part that both Jackie and Lee Bouvier, her younger sister, got along with their new siblings. She was especially close with her stepbrother Yusha, and if you ever read Camera Girl by Carl Anthony, you can read some of their letters in which they share a lovely friendship. Now, despite being highly privileged, Janet and Jackie, I apologize, Jackie and Lee, named after her mother, would feel that they were not as well off as the Auchincloss siblings because they were granted a higher allowance than the Bouvier children. It is speculated that the Bouvier girls only received about $50 a month for their allowance, whereas the Auchincloss children could have easily had double, if not almost triple that, for a monthly allowance. In fact, Jackie, still being a very privileged young woman, would attend Miss Porter's school where she graduated in 1947. And while there, she was able to board her favorite horse, courtesy of one of her grandfathers, and she even joined the student newspaper, getting up to occasional mischief. In her own original style, though, when asked for her senior yearbook, a direct quote about her aspirations, She was directly quoted in saying that my aspiration in life is to not be a housewife. Spring of 1947, which is the same year she graduated Miss Porter's school, Jacqueline Bouvier was considered out to society as she had her debutante ball that year. More than that, she was also named the 1947 Debutante of the Year, making her what we would call a celebutante or a social celebrity. Following this honor, she became a familiar presence at social register dances, dinners, luncheons, and teas. She seemed to simply accept her designation as Deb of the Year, and even posed in November 1947 for the New York Times as such. Thus, she was not only launched into society, but even further launched into the limelight with this new title. After making her appearance at the New York Debutante Cotillion and Christmas Ball in December of 1947, she posed with several other debutantes for a Life magazine photo. Now, unfortunately, the photo was never published in the end, but this became Jackie Bouvier's first paycheck that she herself earned. She then considered making a living as a print model, to which, as I'm sure you can imagine, both sets of parents vehemently disagreed with. Still, young Jackie Bouvier really liked making her own money, and she liked the independence that it allowed her to have. By 1949, Jackie Bouvier lived for socializing every weekend possible. As I said, Carl Anthony discusses this a lot in the early part of Camera Girl. He denoted that she indulged in her expensive tastes and, quote, flirted her way into the heart of any beau that she wanted. Now, despite many in her debutante class marrying off quickly, Bouvier actually spent that summer attending wedding after wedding, happy to not be a bride yet herself. Junior year at Vassar, she studied abroad in France, specifically at the Sorbonne, where she stayed with a French family and became fully immersed in French culture. Now, as her term ended in the Sorbonne, she had a second one in which she would be excited to move to the heart of it all, Paris. There, it is speculated that she judged multiple beaux, including, you'll see here on the screen, American writer John Marquand. Now, according to her friend and distant relative Gore Vidal, it was Marquand that Jackie would lose her virginity to in a stalled lift in Paris. Now, being a true gentleman, John Marquand denied this as untrue, but this is just one of many examples in which you can see that the public, even before she's First Lady, are enthralled with young Jackie, soon to be Kennedy, all of her relationships and affairs. Now, she was expected home that June by her mother so that she could attend Lee's own debutante ball. And despite these plans, she did not return until mid-September 1950 to finish her senior year at George Washington University. There, in DC, she got to stay a little bit closer to her mother, Janet, and her stepfather, Hugh D. Auchincloss, which would actually make Black Jack Bouvier very unhappy, as Vassar was closer to where he was, based in New York City. Still, it was regularly chronicled by society papers as to what her travel plans would be and her intentions for the fall semester. With her Deb of the Year status, her time at Miss Porter's, especially her time abroad, Jacqueline Bouvier had already begun a public profile that marked her as a member of the elite. As I mentioned, Jackie Bouvier liked making her own money. Upon her return from Europe, and despite her own mother's concerns about her marriage prospects, she had little intention of settling down so quickly. This time, rather than being the focus of the paper, as she had been for most of her formative years, she was now the one actually reporting for a paper when she was granted the job of the inquiring cameraman for the Washington Times-Herald. Although it was her family connections that got her in the door, her stepfather helped her get the job, she took about any position that she could get, including the inquiring cameraman, which was originally reserved as kind of a punishment for reporters who weren't doing a very good job, because an inquiring cameraman was required 6 days a week to be on the ground interviewing just about anybody they could. Regardless, she took the job assignment and made it entirely her own. Eventually, the segment became so popular, it was renamed the Inquiring Camera Girl, and she got her own byline, Jacqueline Bouvier. The column averaged 144 individual interviews monthly, totaling 2,600 people that she'd interviewed by the time she left this role. As the inquiring camera girl, young Jacqueline Bouvier was required to simply confront everyday Americans and ask their opinions on a wide range of topics. Some of these questions include, do you think you're normal? Or who's braver in the dentist chair, men or women? Sometimes it even included questions like, if you could meet any first lady of the United States, who would it be? As the inquiring camera girl, Jackie Bouvier interviewed just about anyone that she could per her assignment, and sometimes this even meant talking to children through a schoolyard fence, which would later she would regret after having her own children and seeing how the press treated children when interviewing them. Some friends remarked that during this time, and although Jackie was engaged to a John Husted, she seemed more excited for her work at the Washington Times-Herald rather than her impending nuptials. During this engagement, she actually became acquainted briefly with John F. Kennedy, whom she'd initially written off as a flirt. Yet, while being both in D.C. after she had broken off her engagement to John Husted, the two found themselves often in the same circles, especially following their introduction at a private dinner party hosted by the Bartlett family in 1951. The Bartletts, Charles and Margaret, were both mutual friends to the Bouviers and the Kennedys, and those two were specifically members of the wedding party later as well. Despite being behind the camera as the inquiring camera girl for a year and a half, Jackie Bouvier soon got thrust back into the political and media spotlight when she became engaged to the handsome, up-and-coming Senator John F. Kennedy. The pair, noted for being exceptionally good-looking, became instant celebrities overnight, and Americans became enthralled with the couple, especially as Kennedy moved up in his public career. The wedding, which took place on September 12, 1953, was one detailed in media across the country. Now, unfortunately, what should have been the happiest day of her life was actually tainted by her own father. And there are many who speculate how this happened, but unfortunately, Black Jack Bouvier was unable to walk his eldest daughter down the aisle on her wedding day. There are some who speculate that it was Janet, who had encouraged the men at the bachelor party the night prior to help Black Jack Bouvier get a little bit more intoxicated. And there are some that believe that he was just genuinely already struggling with alcoholism and simply overdone it the night before. Unfortunately, regardless, he was either still intoxicated or too unwell to walk Jackie Bouvier down the wedding aisle. It was actually her stepfather, Hugh D. Auchincloss, who ended up walking her down the aisle. And she loved her stepfather very much. But she still, you can probably imagine then that special moment between father and daughter was just simply not shared. And one of her cousins even said, "I'd never seen a bride so beautiful and yet so sad." In their marriage, Jackie Kennedy was instrumental in her husband's bid for the presidency. And to do so, she used her celebrity status to engage with the press, but this time on her own terms. And she was fluent in 5 languages, including English, French, Italian, Spanish, and even German. And she recorded a campaign video for her husband on live television entirely in Spanish. You can see here a few photos of them on the campaign trail leading up to, of course, the inauguration as well. We do know that she did participate on the campaign trail pretty much until her doctor told her that she no longer should due to her current pregnancy. As I was saying, during JFK's campaign, Jackie Kennedy became pregnant with John Jr., also known as John John, who you can see pictured here with the teddy bear. It's a lovely picture of him and his mother. This was the 4th time, actually, that Jackie Kennedy was pregnant, and John Jr. was born by an emergency cesarean section, just like his older sister Caroline was. Prior to Caroline and John, Jackie herself had a miscarriage in 1955, and in 1956, she did give birth to a daughter that they named Arabella, who unfortunately was born stillborn. It was because of Jackie's celebrity status and the publicity surrounding her that actually Americans became more aware of women's health concerns. especially those surrounding a cesarean section procedure. Yet, as her children grew up in the White House, it was also that same publicity that helped normalize women's health issues that constantly also wanted to capture photos of her children and were willing to be invasive to do so. As a reporter who herself had interviewed children when she probably shouldn't have, you can imagine that this struck a chord within Jackie Kennedy as she reflected on this lack of privacy for children. She felt even more protective of her own children, and a pure example of this is that when Carolyn Kennedy's school was photographed, including the 5-year-old herself, First Lady Kennedy asked that her picture not be put in the paper. For once, the press obliged, and as a thank you, Mrs. Kennedy wrote a lovely thank you to the photographer Ellen Key Blunt, which reads as follows: "Dear Miss Blunt, I want to tell you how much I appreciated your asking about using the picture of Carolyn in the costume class and then not using it when I said I hoped you wouldn't. That is just an incredibly decent gesture. Please tell your editor what a fine person you are. I think it is wonderful that the Post operates that way." Having just had a rather shattering experience with someone who promised that they wouldn't use pictures of my daughter at another little show, and I believed her and stayed at the show, and then they all appeared, I am doubly appreciative. I know that newspapers need to print different, or rather unusual photos. Find there is always the conflict of trying to raise one's children fairly normally. So when you, who are torn both ways, respect a little girl's chance to have a happy day with other children, who fortunately treat her as just another 4-year-old, that is almost the only public place where she isn't singled out and fawned over, it is amazing and consoling. I think you made the right decision, the humane one. But what you did is rare, and I do want you to know how impressed and deeply grateful her father and I are. Sincerely, Jacqueline Kennedy. Now, unfortunately, amid the joys of Camelot, Jackie Kennedy's world was shaken to its core when she first arrived in Dallas, Texas. Her first public appearance following the death of their 5th child, Patrick Bouvier Kennedy, in 1963. Already in mourning, Mrs. Kennedy was actually hesitant to be back in the limelight after baby Patrick died in John F. Kennedy's lap. Knowing that Texas, though, was an important state in the upcoming election, she decided it was vital to be alongside her husband for part of his re-election campaign. And again, her first public appearance after losing their 5th child in August of that year. And unfortunately, I think sometimes I don't have words for this because we can only imagine what she must have been feeling and going through. So I typically like to just use a quote from Jackie Kennedy herself. "Don't let it be forgot that once there was a spot for one brief shining moment that was known as Camelot. There will be great presidents again. There will never be another Camelot again." It took the Kennedy staff until 1965 to respond to every single piece of mail sent to Mrs. Kennedy following her husband's assassination in 1963. Following this event, as I said, Jackie Kennedy's life was completely uprooted. She was no longer First Lady of the United States. She needed to move out of the White House. And yet, despite no longer being First Lady, she couldn't seem to take the spotlight off of herself. Tour buses would drive by her personal home in Georgetown and suggest that tourists snap pictures of Mrs. Kennedy's apartment in hopes they might get a glimpse of her or her children. Even after moving then to New York City, tour buses and paparazzi still bombarded Mrs. Kennedy. Some even said that they should try to get a picture of her getting changed. Now, even though some moved on, they didn't realize that Jackie Kennedy was still a celebrity. She absolutely was. Following her time as First Lady, she remained in the public eye regardless of if she wanted to. Any man, in fact, that she was seen with was speculated to be a lover or a potential new fiancé. The individuals ranged from the expected to sometimes the most completely outrageous speculations, each scandal more salacious than the last. Now, some of these affairs to remember, and I hope you'll pardon my pun, include Bobby Kennedy, uncle to their children, brother to John F. Kennedy himself, Bobby Kennedy seemed to many the natural next lover, fiance, future father to children in Jackie Kennedy's life. The two were good and close friends, and they were very sweet together, but that is all that they ever were. They were simply friends. Because Bobby Kennedy was another handsome member of the Kennedy clan, many Americans fantasized the two would come back together and renew Camelot again. There are many others too. I'm just going to touch on a few this afternoon because, especially when tabloids start to become more popular, I'll show a few of those as well. Jackie Kennedy is often on the front cover. Another potential speculated lover, fiance, future husband includes the former British ambassador David Ormsby Gore, also known as Lord Harlech. Harlech had been a close friend of the Kennedy family, and actually, Jackie Kennedy and Lord Harlech traveled to Cambodia together in November of 1967, which was a highly publicized trip, and causing much speculation that they were romantically involved. This has been proven. We do know that they potentially had started a courtship, but the widowed Jackie Kennedy was still not quite ready to accept his marriage proposal. You can see all the way to the right, that is from a magazine in which someone speculated, well, when Jackie Kennedy marries Lord Harlech, I think she'll wear one of these designs. And then they had all the designs at the top of what she might wear for her next wedding dress. Now, she did turn down his proposal, and she actually said that she wanted to start her life anew and was starting to meet and get to know Aristotle Onassis and wanted to start her life anew with him. She wrote to Lord Harlech, if I can ever find some healing and some comfort, it has to be with somebody who is not part of all of my world of past and pain. She said, if I can find that now, if the world will let us. Now, one of my personal favorite affairs, because this is just silly, includes Sonny Bono himself. You can see at the bottom that Cher is stunned, and the whole thing is incredibly shocking. TV picture Life was a tabloid journalism at its most brazen. Borrowing not only Life's magazine title, it was also piggybacked on its reputation for quality photojournalism. You do have to hand it to the person that linked these photos together at a long time before Photoshop was even invented. You can also see another potential affair in which Photo Screen linked Jackie with the youngest Kennedy brother, Ted, by superimposing a random hand on top of Ted's shoulder and splicing the two together, actually, for the cover so that it looks as if they were actually together. Now, we know that Jackie was close to Ted as well as all of the Kennedy siblings, but the tabloids loved to pull the Kennedy card because it kept the idea of Camelot alive. Although she had already met Aristotle Onassis in her younger years, including when she was with John F. Kennedy, they had met him together, he actually eventually became the ideal scenario for a new partner that could potentially provide privacy. When she married Aristotle Onassis in 1968, Aristotle Onassis was the richest man in the world. And when she married him, the American public became distraught. To many Americans, Onassis was not good enough for Jackie, who was placed on a high pedestal by both the press and Americans. Yet it was Onassis, being the wealthiest man alive in the world, who had private yachts and private islands, private planes, in which Jackie may finally get a chance to live in peace away from the prying eyes of mass media. As many of us know, Jackie Kennedy Onassis was almost always noted for her beauty. Even when you saw those childhood photos of her, she was always regarded as a lovely woman. She was always noted for her physique, but it was in the late 1960s and early 1970s that tabloids took it to a new and quite invasive level. Even after being married to Aristotle Onassis, photographers stalked her, and magazines like the National Enquirer even boasted nude photos of Jackie while being on Onassis's private island or yacht. Now, more than ever, as you can probably imagine, Jackie Onassis was in a desperate need of privacy. She even filed a lawsuit twice with the photographer who constantly snapped her pictures, including the nude photos, Ron Galella. Now, the lawsuit, interestingly enough, was not about him taking photos of her, but rather keeping a distance of 25 feet away from her and 50 feet away from her children. In fact, the photo you see here where she's walking with the wind blowing away her hair is snapped by Ron Galella after she left the court, winning her lawsuit against him. And he is, for once, not directly on top of her practically. Now, Jackie Kennedy Onassis's life did not end with her first husband's assassination, nor did it end when her second husband, Aristotle Onassis, also died in 1975. In fact, throughout all of this, JKO, as we called her, continued to live her life the way that she had always intended, by her own design. Her love of the arts and literature remained with her throughout her entire life, later becoming a book editor for both Viking Press and then also Doubleday. She continued to challenge social norms and use her heightened platform and publicity to draw attention to causes that were special to her, including conservation and preservation of historic buildings and sharing marginalized stories. As a book editor, she was responsible for helping to publish books on women's history, art, and even one which at the time was groundbreaking on Sally Hemings, despite pushback from Jeffersonian historians. Her legacy then is lasting. From her pillbox hats to her great affairs of the heart, Jackie Kennedy Onassis resonates with many of us just given her true humanity. I'm sure that many of us can all find at least one aspect of her life that is very complex, that touches each of us individually. Now, despite her naturally introverted nature, Jackie Kennedy Onassis's life was one often exposed to the public in ways that invaded her inherent privacy and that all of us regular individuals are privy to. So we think about the fact that when we talk about our first ladies, that we should still give them the grace that we are so luckily afforded when dealing with the press and mass media to this day. I do like to also close with a quote from Miss JKO herself that I think is just lovely. She says, even though people may be well known, such as herself, they hold in their hearts the emotions of a simple person for the moments that are most important that we know here on earth: birth, marriage, and death. I've put my contact information if you have questions that we don't get to today, because I'd love to hear them. And if I don't have an answer, I will find an answer for you. But I'd like to share now a few of those archival objects we mentioned earlier. So I'm going to get out of this and stop sharing my screen. And I hope that you all can see me. And I thank you for being so patient and listening to my presentation. It's a treat to talk with you all and to see how many of you are from all over the United States. Feel free while I'm doing this to go ahead and start putting your questions in the chat, and Gypsy's going to help me moderate those here in a second. But it's amazing what a collection can contain. The amount of Jackie Kennedy and Kennedy family plates that we at one point had was astronomical. Because as soon as they took office as First Lady and President of the United States, or even the incumbent, people loved to make plates of them. And in fact, this is part of a whole set. This is just one plate of many. You even have, once John was born, you even have this one of the Kennedy family. So you can see Miss Jackie Kennedy herself there, of course, John F. Kennedy. And then you've got little John and Miss Caroline. And Caroline is still alive to this day. She's actually a diplomat in New Zealand, and everything she does is incredible. We also have, of course, and this is the 60s. So you also have to have, of course, salt and pepper shakers of the first family. And they are, I'll hold them a little closer. These are not bad portraits, really. Some things we see of first ladies, they are not that great. These ones are very, very good in their ability to highlight the best features of an individual. Now, this is not the pillbox hat, but this is a pillbox hat that you can see here. This one's actually a pink feather one. And you can see I'm wearing my white gloves, of course, because the oil on my hands would actually damage some of these objects. Now, plates are not as sensitive, but fabrics and textiles are the most sensitive. Photographs only coming a close second to it. But what's really interesting is, as many people know, once JKO, Jackie Kennedy, wore the pillbox hat for the first time, everyone wanted the bouffant hairstyle and they wanted the hat. It was actually on the inauguration that she was wearing that pillbox hat, that first one, and the wind knocked it off. When she put it on, she accidentally slightly dented it. And so that's the style for the longest time, that's how women wanted a dented pillbox hat. Although some still really enjoyed a very traditional undented pillbox hat. We actually know someone, if you know of Monty Durham, Say Yes to the Dress Atlanta, his mother actually, he donated one of her outfits to us because it is modeled after a Jackie Kennedy outfit with a shift dress, lovely 60s shoes, and even a pillbox hat. We also have, as I said, we have a number of tabloids. So this is, I'm not making these pictures up. This is a real tabloid from Photo Screen, the one with the Ted Kennedy superimposed hand. This is one of many, because we also have, even though it doesn't look like she's too featured on Women's World, you've also got Jackie, where you find her eating, sleeping, shopping, and selling her old clothes. So she was still being followed regularly. Of course, you've got Jackie's Love Nest, in which they were boasting nude photos of her and Onassis. And this really set off a bit in press history. That lawsuit in which she was able to get space from Ron Galella is incredible. This one actually is titled Privacy and versus History, which is very interesting. It's something that we talk about regularly here at the National First Ladies Library Museum, because this is still the press, but they're trying to denote it as privacy is okay to be invaded if it's for the sake of history. But I think that there is still a fine line that we walk. We also have exclusive more nude photos of Jackie Kennedy Onassis. And then some other things that I like to show a little bit earlier from the presentation is, I often say to people when they ask, Jackie Kennedy is a pop culture icon. Jackie Kennedy Onassis remains as such. She saves Grand Central Station. She restores the White House, Lafayette Square. She's invested in the arts. She is horseback riding until the day that she discovers that she's got swollen lymph nodes, which is later diagnosed as non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. So this wonderfully cultured woman becomes such a pop culture icon, even in grieving. This is supposed to be a mourning vase, you can see here, of Miss Jackie Kennedy following the assassination. And this one I think is very impactful, because we think about the fact that she really was mourning, and yet a vase was made of her to display as such. On a slightly lighter note, though, the press, the American public, are so infatuated with the Kennedys that, and you'll see this a lot in First Lady and women's history, dolls. They love to talk about dolls. So you even have the Madame Alexander wedding dress and Kennedy dolls, which these are exquisite. Madame Alexander dolls are always really lovely. But you can see here we've got Mr. John F. Kennedy himself wearing a very similar coat, although it's missing its coattails, from his wedding day in 1953. And then, of course, you have, and this, I mean, the dress for a doll's dress is still pretty big, Miss Jackie Kennedy's Ann Lowe designed wedding gown. Now, as I'm packing this up, I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have, and I'd be happy to show something again as well. How are we feeling, Gypsy?
Yes, well, this is just wonderful. We do have a request that you maybe could share your screen again about your contact information.
Absolutely.
And then we have some wonderful comments from participants. Cindy says, I love your presentation and have learned so much. Thanks so much. I love that she was her own woman from a young age. Yep. Kathleen says, thank you. And Maria Teresa says, this presentation was wonderful. And she is the person who asked for your contact info. Oh, Cindy also notes that Jackie was such a style icon. And Darlene mentions that she used to attend First Lady Zoom classes until they were beginning to charge for them again, probably after the pandemic. Angela notes that JFK Jr. was never referred to as John except by the press, and he hated it. Uh, and Sharon mentions that this was a great presentation. Thank you. And Cindy also notes that Jackie had so many tragedies in her life, and it's really quite sad. Kathy McDougall poses a question. Do you know where Jackie's wedding dress is? It is beautiful.
Absolutely. Great question. I love it. I will also, if I can, I'll also put my email in the chat if you do have additional questions. So we do have one of the only reproductions made of the gown at our site, which is incredible. I will say it took 3 hours to put away because it's massive. But the original, the story's crazy to me. The original Jackie Kennedy wedding gown was found stuffed in a sack. And then eventually the JFK library restored it and has safely been able to store it, conserve it, and so it currently resides there. The reproduction that we have, very similar to some of these items, came to us from Monty Durham from Say Yes to the Dress. Priscilla of Boston was one of the stores that he worked with, and I guess they needed to settle up a bill, and they asked him what he wanted, how he wanted it paid, and he said, I want a reproduction Jackie Kennedy wedding gown. And they said, we don't really do that. And he said, yeah, but that's what I want. And so they made it for him. When we decided to we did a Jackie Kennedy exhibit actually last year. It was called Beyond Camelot, the life and legacy of Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy Onassis. And it was all about her life before, during, after her time in the White House, because she really only serves about 1,000 days in the White House, if you think about it, which is just, and she accomplishes so much. I have a whole other presentation just about that exhibit, but we wanted to have a wedding dress on display. And when we saw a picture of him, our senior curator saw a picture of him in a book with the gown. And so we reached out as an organization and said, would you be willing to loan it to us for this exhibit? And he said, no, but I will give it to you. So along with the dress came, apparently he's a big Jackie Kennedy fan, for those of you that didn't know this, such a big fan that his house, one room was entirely dedicated to her. So plates, hats, pictures, letters, everything, including the gown. And so he donated his whole Jackie Kennedy Onassis room to the National First Ladies Library Museum, which is how we get that reproduction. But the original gown is housed at the John F. Kennedy Library and Museum in Boston. Long-winded answer, but it's a cool story. I like to tell it.
Well, as a follow-up question, would you mind sharing the story of Anne Lowe's creation of the gown?
Absolutely. Another story I love. Anne Lowe, for those of you who may not have heard of her, although many have started to hear about her, we often say she's kind of having a renaissance, because I think you hear about her once and then you don't stop hearing about her. She's this incredible woman of color who actually, her ancestry is tied directly to enslavement, in which their trade is often seamstress work. So her mother and her grandmother were both seamstresses by trade, although I believe it is her grandmother who was formerly enslaved. And she is commissioned. Often she's considered the hidden seamstress of the elite, is often how she's regarded. And she is commissioned for a number of debutante ball gowns, and then eventually is hired for the Kennedy wedding, in which the week before the wedding, again, being a woman of color in the early 1960s, even though she was this incredible businesswoman and a self-starter, she often didn't get the best studio spaces. So her studio, when she was crafting the Jackie Kennedy wedding gown, alongside the other bridesmaids' gowns and junior bridesmaid gowns, which we speculate is about 12 to 14 maybe, a flood happens actually on the floors above her. Her studio's in the basement of where she'd been working. The flood actually ruins all of the gowns. Now, apparently there's a direct quote from her where she said, there is no time to cry. And she just gets right back to work. She rallies the troops. She rallies her mom, her family, her workers, and they recreate within those, 7 to 10 days, the Jackie Kennedy wedding gown. And she never tells anyone. So she also eats that profit because she had to replace everything to remake the gown. She completely eats that profit. Apparently no one ever knows about it. But later, Anne Lowe struggles with glaucoma and is starting to partially go blind. She has all these mounting financial issues. She has a lot of mounting medical bills. And curiously enough, someone pays some of her bills. And she is also quoted as saying that she thought it was Jackie, that she found out what she'd done for her on her first wedding day and how much work went into that gown, and in a way kind of repaid her for it, although she was not supposed to know, which you'll find a lot with First Lady's history. A First Lady does something anonymously, but it's never really anonymous. And so she does always think, if you look into Anne Love, she does often say that she thinks it was Jackie Kennedy.
Thank you for sharing that. Michelle mentions, I believe there was a replica of the gown in an exhibit on the designer that was exhibited at Winthrop Museum. And the museum has a connection with Jackie as she worked with one of the DuPonts to renovate the White House.
Yes, that sounds right. And we actually had last fall the curator of that Anne Lowe exhibit do a program for us. It was lovely. Like I said, you hear about Anne Lowe once lately, and now I feel like I can't stop talking about her. People want to know about her. I think it's due time that she got the attention she deserves.
Bethany mentions that, thank you for this presentation. I lived through this era and remember so many things that you brought to our attention. And Marie mentions, what an interesting story and presentation. So happy to be part of the large group of admirers. And then we have a question from Cindy, who says, how did you find a job like this? It's fascinating.
Well, as I'm sure you can probably tell, I love my job. I love what I do here. Fun fact, I actually originally went to culinary school. I was a chef for a few years and I loved it. But every time I was doing anything with food and culture, especially when we got into our international cuisine courses, I kept being like, well, what about the culture? What about the people? I'd always wanted to be a historian, and my path kind of skewed a little bit. But after I finished culinary school, and I was still working obviously to put myself through school in kitchens and restaurants, I went back to school for history, anthropology, and classics. And I was actually telling my boss this the other day. No matter what I did, whatever paper, whatever research, it was always about women. And I was so fascinated by these people that don't get talked about ever. It's always rulers and kings and important politicians, and never really talking about the women who are sometimes pushing along some progressive ideals just as much as the men are. I got very interested in that. That ended up being pretty much all I researched, regardless of the era. And then when I got into my master's study, I actually did some projects on the Kennedy administration using my food background to talk about culinary diplomacy and how the Kennedy administration used food as a diplomatic tool. And that just kind of continued to spiral it. I've worked for a couple other historical sites, every time wanting to talk about women's place in it, and then also American enslavement. And this has been my dream job for a very long time. I applied for an internship when I was 20 and they didn't have anything available. And when this position came open, it's actually my older sister who said, isn't this your dream job? They just opened up a role. I was like, oh my gosh. And I think I was the 6th applicant. And I was very fortunate that they took a chance on me as a young historian. And like I said, every day's a dream. So pure luck and that I like women's history. So that's a great question. Thank you, Cindy.
Well, thank you, Stephanie, for such a wonderful presentation. And Lynn Hall mentions interesting stories. Thank you. And Cindy says, thank you, Stephanie, for educating us about women. I think it's so important. And we at AARP Idaho want to thank all of you who participated today. And please join us for future events at the website that we posted in the chat. That same link will be available year-round as we have activities planned. And I see Stephanie has also shared her contact information at firstladies.org. And Antoinette mentions, thank you and wonderful presentation. Thank you to everyone for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. This really was a treat. It was so great to talk with all of you from across this nation who are so interested in what we do here. So thank you so much. Do check out our website, join our programs if you're able to do so, and I hope to see you all again soon.
When we have a quick question from Lexi, who asks if you are in Ohio.
I am. I'm in Canton, Ohio, right downtown. As I said, the historic Saxton McKinley House, childhood home to Ida McKinley, is just part of our campus. And then I'm in the visitor center main museum building. Yes, I am in Ohio, and I'm biased. I grew up here. I love Ohio.
Well, we're so fortunate that we all got to join you from all around the United States today. There in Ohio.
Thank
So
you so much.
thank you again.